Colleagues, good afternoon. I'm glad to welcome you at the Moscow site of the Valdai Club. My name is Andrei Sushentsov. I am Program Director of the Valdai International Discussion Club, Dean of the School of International Relations at Gimor University. Today we'll speak about the presentation and discussion dedicated to a report by the Valdai Discussion Club, Warfare in a New Epoch, the Return of Big Armies. We have initiated that report as a result of a discussion around the very phenomena of a war. What a war is about in our new age, what the new dimensions may emerge, or what old obstacles, circumstances may return, and what we mean by an armed conflict. Along with the co-authors of the report, Mr. Kashin, and along with our panelists, we will discuss how the hostilities and armed conflicts are evolving in various locations. Among the panelists are Evgeny Buzhinsky, Lieutenant General retired, Chairman of the Peer Center, was Dmitry Stefanovich, researcher from IMMO, Russian Academy of Sciences, and Gregory Simons, an independent expert from Sweden. Welcome. And probably, kickstarting our discussion, I would like to share some of my views that underlie the report, and after that I will pass the floor to the panelists. Certainly, the starting point of our discussion was the root causes of conflict in Ukraine, its military, political, and strategic dimensions. This conflict, just many other conflicts that we observe, would deny a point of view which dominated 20-30 years ago, that a war is waged with small forces, and usually it would be waged in some remote highland terrain, and it has to be actually done by a little professional army using high-precision weapons. But the conflict in Ukraine is totally opposite, and it brings back the idea of big armies. Again, we see quite long front line, which is comparable to the front lines during the World War II. We see some mobilization efforts, and this is true for the personnel, this is true for the hardware and equipment, this is true for the mobilization of the production forces. Diplomatic efforts have been summoned in order to bring about a kind of an alliance support in Ukraine. It attests to the fact that the war is the same phenomena that we observed before that crisis. And the dominating point of view was a kind of a stereotype of an illusion, which proceeded from the experience of American expeditions in Iraq and Afghanistan. With the time, these operations translated into politically unviable efforts, thus making the United States withdraw their troops from these regions, giving up the idea to bring about democracy to these regions. And the Americans had to reduce their big goals to more realistic ones, according to the analytic job that the American military did in the North years, trying to identify why they are there in the region. They came up with the formula that the very idea of the U.S. troops' presence there is not building a democracy, according to Jefferson, but creating necessary conditions that would let the United States withdraw the troops without losing a face. So this is a realistic goal. We're using today's experience of the modern crisis and conflicts in order to identify certain tendencies in how the military philosophy is evolving and how the theory is used in practice. This is not a perfect metaphor, but the current crisis acts as a lab of the modern warfare. We see that the history is still unfolding in front of our eyes, and this is not the end of the history, as was predicted by many Western experts. The history is unfolding in front of our eyes, and last week the Israeli-Palestinian crisis reached a hot phase, and it shows that the stale and old conflicts may become heated, and they could be described with the metaphors which are pertinent to big armed conflicts. I would like to pass the floor to my co-author, Vasily Kashenko, Director at the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies, High School of Economics. Mr. Kashin, over to you.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you so much.
Да, мы можем видеть сейчас и конфликт на Украине.
As we see now, and the Ukrainian crisis is not unique in that sense, that conflicts that emerge between the states, different groups of states, and the states and different political movements become more and more large-scale and would pursue more decisive goals, and would show that all the stakeholders are ready to make sacrifices, which, for a number of decades that lapsed since the end of the Cold War, but even since 1960s, were believed totally impossible, intolerable. For quite a while, there was an important argument in favor of saying that such conflicts sank into oblivion, was that these conflicts do not make sense. That usually the one who initiates a conflict is a loser, because if a goal is attained, then the price would be absolutely intolerable for the society. The perception of the price of the victory and what is tolerable and what is not tolerable changes as long as the nature of relations between the states change and the interstate tensions, how they are perceived within the countries. The states are ready to make sacrifices in order to attain their political goals, the sacrifices that seemed unlikely before because the very nature of relations between the stakeholders would change. Something that seemed to be carved in stone now is doubted very much. The balance of forces changes. The United States may remain the biggest country in terms of the size of their economy, but this is no longer the biggest country in terms of most of the industries. I mean, first of all, manufacturing industry. And the United States is losing their stance and their position in many other areas as well. Alternative views emerge regarding the world order. The People's Republic of China proposed a whole number of different concepts, very holistic ones, comprehensive ones, which are being offered as an alternative to the Western view. Some countries have to desperately protect their positions, which used to be guaranteed, but other countries see some opportunities. And inside every big country, internal tensions are on the rise. Almost everyone, including the Western countries, and at the same time, many non-Western countries, such as China, for instance, go through very painful reform and restructuring of the economic model. Internal crisis takes place within the societies. The societies is split, is polarized, which was unprecedented before. And the perception and tolerance towards the conflict also changes. As a result, we see the emergence of the Ukrainian conflict, and many experts, including me, didn't believe in the possibility of that full-scale conflict that actually acquired in nature of a big regional war. And the
на протяжении жизни нескольких
conflict in the Middle East that we see now
вероятно,
is the
подобное же
biggest
и на Дальнем
in
Востоке.
the last decades, and some tensions emerge also in the Far East, and many do not want to believe in such likelihood.
Очень затратные шаги,
But we see very costly steps made by certain parties in order to get prepared for the future conflict. And
была всегда за
we get back to the old normal,
примерно с
which
70-х
existed
годов.
starting from 1970s and until 2010,
Мы жили в своего рода розовых очках,
when we were wearing
можем
pink glasses, believing that we can build our armed forces following
адаптированные
a
для
model which is adapted
небольших локальных
for
конфликтов.
small, localized conflicts. We believe that nuclear arms may secure us against any encroachments. And that means that all the big countries will have to get back to the basics of the military and economic and war planning,
Были общепринятыми во второй
which were
половине
common in the second half
века. И
of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. What we considered in our report was about the political consequences,
за собой гигантские
keeping
последствия.
the country ready for a large-scale conflict entails a lot of consequences for politics, for culture, for the economy, because you have to bear in mind
Возможность мобилизации,
the likelihood of mobilization or
защиты страны,
calling
что требует
the
совсем
people
другого
for
подхода к
active military duty, and it requires totally different things from the system of education and culture. We remember that how the system of education was perceived in different countries in the first half of the 20th century, and what problems it was designed to address. It means that such a new paradigm requires a totally different attitude towards an industrial policy, in essence.
обеспечения определенного уровня самодостаточности.
Self-sufficiency has to be achieved even in detriment to the level of technological development and to the quality. And
гражданами
this changes the
политической элиты,
relations between the political elite and rank-and-file people.
то, как граждане
It changes how
политику, потому что теперь это
ordinary citizens perceive the foreign policy, because no longer it is detached
теперь плохая внешняя
from
политика.
their everyday life. Now, a poor foreign policy cannot result in just losses or some conflict which would be fought by a small army in some remote places. And even if you lose in that conflict, it would have meant that you would lose some professional soldiers and lose some money. But in that case, nowadays, such a conflict may claim lives of your family members. So this is a big change that awaits us all.
Такой процесс,
And that's a basic process that
что нашего мира на
certainly affects our world order in the years to come. Thank you so much. Mr. Bushinsky participated in the situational analysis that resulted in that report, and we discussed different circumstances
украинского кризиса и
and root causes of the Ukrainian crisis and the training of the armed forces in China and other major countries,
как они себе представляют следующую возможную
how
войну.
they perceive another future war. Mr. Bushinsky will appreciate very much your input,
Спасибо.
and don't be limited by the report itself.
О докладе тут
Well, a few words about the report.
согласен с
I would 90% agree with what's been written there regarding the nature of the wars,
дальнейших, вернее, следующих войн, которые, несомненно,
subsequent wars that would be waged, and that's inevitable.
конечно, о войнах с применением только обычных
And certainly we are speaking about conventional weapons only, because nuclear wars would bear a totally different nature.
войн с применением тактических
There
ядерных.
cannot be any limited wars with the use of tactical nuclear arms, in my opinion. It will scale up it would translate into a local conflict or regional conflict, which may entail dire consequences for the whole mankind.
Доклад посвящен в основном анализу.
The report is dedicated to the analysis of the Ukrainian conflict.
Я не очень согласен. Да, ну, во-первых, когда мы говорим о
When we
масштабной войне,
speak about a full-scale war, and this term is being used by the authors of the report, we have to define that properly. The Ukrainian crisis has translated into a full-scale war with
никто не может точно сказать, когда он закончится.
no one can say exactly when it would be over. No one can say what would be the outcomes, and certainly it would end with the victory of the Russian armed forces for objective reasons, certainly. But the ultimate goals of the special military operation, unfortunately, are not defined, are not identified, and I had to deal a lot with a CFE treaty. In early 2000s, when we withdrew from that treaty, we suspended that treaty as far as it lacked adequacy. It was totally detached from reality.
Осмысление, что делать дальше.
We had to think what to do next. A new treaty was needed, and no one was speaking about the scale. No one was speaking about the duration of the conflict. All the experts were speaking about new categories of weapons,
Танковые сражения в Европе — это уже
that
немыслимо. Артиллерийские
tank
дуэли,
battles are not possible in Europe, and the duels between the artillery, between the cannons and guns also is in the past, and
массированные бомбардировки,
mass bombings, the use of high-precision weapons, unmanned vehicles, overwhelming of the enemy's troops,
иракский,
etc.
иракская война
The Iraqi War, the second Iraqi War,
продемонстрировала,
showcased that very well.
все раздолбали
First,
враг с воздуха,
everything was bombed by the bombers. In addition, the Republican Guard was bribed, and Baghdad was seized almost without losses. What Ukrainian crisis showed,
один абзац,
I actually
как российская, так и украинская армия на раннем этапе
can argue one
демонстрировали отсутствие
paragraph.
навыков для ведения
Both Russian and Ukrainian troops showed that they are totally not prepared for a large-scale war that resulted in major losses from both sides. I cannot agree with that. We started that very well in February 2022.
начали
And the beginning
с учетом опыта тех же американцев.
was relying on the experience of the United States troops. If you remember the reports from the front lines in early March and middle March 2022, we suppressed 75% of the anti-aircraft forces. We bombed airfields. We destroyed most of the aircrafts, Ukrainian aircrafts, on ground, and destroyed the Ukrainian Navy. Actually, the ports did exist, but there were no vessels there.
Все те ошибки,
And then we repeated all the mistakes that we committed during the first Chechnya war. We stopped and started negotiations. So we actually sent our troops to Gostomel, and they kept that stronghold as long as they could. But we stopped the
американские спрашивали, что вы делаете?
hostility, and we started negotiations. My American colleagues asked me, what are you doing? Because what the Americans would do, they would immediately engage strategic aviation. They would totally destroy, eradicate the whole military infrastructure, and would not stop, would not halt until the final treaty is signed. Not initialed by some person who has no authority, but it had to be signed. That had to be a surrender signed by the President Zelensky. In that case, it would be all over. So the blame is put not on the incompetent commanders who are not familiar with the tactics. And I do not know who tipped the authors that the experience of the Afghanistan war was not studied. No, we studied that. We couldn't use that during the first war in Chechnya, but during the second war in Chechnya, it was very efficient. What the Ukrainian crisis has shown, so the tanks are back to the battlefield, artillery is back to the battlefield, and certainly it is longer range, it is higher precision. The drones performed very well, and I must say that regarding the drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, for 8 years I worked in a concern after my retirement, the concern which is producing the drones. As of 2010, it seemed that we are lagging behind forever, that we will never catch up with Israel, with the United States, because we just had a couple of dozens of reconnaissance drones, and as for the strike drones are concerned, they existed only in our dreams. And you can see that within a year and a half of active combat actions, we caught up with our enemies, and in some areas we even outperformed them. Zakharov and his deputies, I remember, it lasted for several years. Zakharov, he is a very talented designer himself, and that's a private company. He's heading a private company, and he was almost suffocated in the sense that some efforts were made in order to somehow subordinate him to something, but he survived. The red tape could not kill him. Then radio-electronic warfare. We outperformed the Americans in that sense, as we outperformed them in terms of the anti-aircraft weapons. Unfortunately, reconnaissance, especially the space reconnaissance, is something that we are lagging behind. Ever since the collapse of the USSR, we cannot even come close to the possibilities and opportunities that we enjoyed during the USSR. I hope that our political leaders are aware of that, and giant steps have been made in order to catch up with our former partners. I think that the industrial mobilization and the report covers that in every detail. Our industry, our defense industry, shows miracles of adapting for that situation, and they are building up the production, the output, increasing the output. I think that the wars to come, bear in mind the Ukrainian crisis, will be waged, and certainly it depends on the enemy and it depends on the objectives. But the tanks will always be there, artillery will always be there. And this is true for all types of guns and cannons. All the means of warfare would remain, but the quality of that would be totally different.
Спасибо большое, Евгений Петрович.
Thank you so much. And so that would like to pass the floor to our colleague from Sweden, Gregory Simons. Gregory, can you hear us? And please speak into the mic.
It's a very interesting report, and I did learn quite a bit from reading it, though there are a number of striking resonances with past wars. So if we look at the current Ukraine war, and I think one of those which did not seem to be picked up in the report was the comparison with the Iraq-Iran war of 1980 to 88. And I think the part that was missed, and this is the similarity between the two, is that these are both proxy wars for geopolitical purposes. Because what happened in 1979, Iranian Revolution. Iran became a geostrategic problem for the United States because it challenged its hegemony. And so the United States is not a land power. It is not a continental power, unless we're talking about on the mainland, North America. It is primarily a naval and air power, and hence it required Iraq as a means to fight Iran. And something which is definitely not remembered in the West are the amount of weapons and supplies that were given to Iraq to fight Iran, including chemical weapons and the so-called wonder weapons. Now, this situation left Iraq not as a subject, but an object of the war, because then it became reliant on the US in order to stay afloat, if we like to say, to remain alive. It required continual weapon supplies and so forth. And one can see some similarities here with Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine is not specifically about Ukraine, and the United States made this clear well before the war even began. So if we look at it, this is more about Europe and the future, geopolitical and geoeconomic future of Europe. And this is not only about preventing Russian influence, but it's also about preventing European independence from the United States. So if we look, 2019, there was a RAND report, and this report stated a strategy by the US to look at the possibilities of imposing cost measures on the Russian Federation. And it suggested a number of different, I suppose you'd call them hybrid warfare, economic warfare, political warfare, different kinds in post-Soviet space. So areas like Belarus, Central Asia, South Caucasus, and Ukraine. They also mentioned Syria. And one can see that these have been rather implemented by events after the presidential elections in Belarus, what happened in Kazakhstan, what's happening in the South Caucasus and Nagorno-Karabakh, and what is currently happening in Ukraine. And this is not a position of strength from the US. Rather, it is an understanding that there is a transformation in the geopolitical order globally, away from this Western-centric US unipolar order towards a more multipolar, non-Western-centric order. So this is an attempt to either delay or to block this. And I mean, this has been stated as an objective by Biden during his election campaign. So we look at the politics of this, and the geopolitics are very clear. There are also some interesting historical parallels too, because if we look beyond this, the effects beyond Ukraine, if we look in Ukraine, they are facing a number, in terms of military capability, capacity, similar problems what the Wehrmacht faced on the Eastern Front. They've got a declining morale, troop numbers are getting eroded. They're using a vast array of different weapon systems, which requires a massive logistical support, which they do not have. So you have these different similarities. And if we look at Ukraine now, the problem for Ukraine is what's happening in Gaza. This takes attention away from Ukraine, and hence the desperation of Zelensky and so forth. But this doesn't detract from their position in this. Ukraine is very much an object of events there. as have other different countries in the past. And I mean, it's interesting how historically the US saw this, because their politicians are not shy from stating quite openly how they envisage this conflict. And there are a lot of assumptions, presumptions, many of which are flawed, but have been rooted with historical experience and interpretation and representation. So, for example, talking about creating another Afghanistan in Ukraine for Russia. So this idea of this ultimate victory wearing down by this attritional war. And you have such blatant statements as that as long as we continue to fund and arm Ukraine, they will fight to the last Ukrainian. So you've got these statements which absolutely go at odds with what rhetorically the media are trying to represent this as. This case of good versus evil, this information war that accompanies every physical war. Every kinetic war has a non-kinetic component. So that is a similarity. What I don't think has been anticipated by the current crop of Western politicians and military leaders are actions have consequences. And wars are not something which should be done lightly, because if you engage in wars, there is a cost to engaging in a war. The deindustrialization of Europe, and you have this increasing gap between the people and the political figures. I mean, Europe at the moment is a vassal state, heading towards a client state. But I think that ultimately what will decide the outcome, because even though battles are decided militarily, the outcome of wars are decided politically. And for the United States, the main patron of Ukraine, along with its European allies, this is not a strategic issue, which it is for the Russian Federation. Hence, the political commitment to war is much higher. And when the pain politically, economically, socially reaches a certain point, this, which I think may be close, then this will be concluded politically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Simons. To follow up your observations, I would like to share one of the ideas that was generated during our situational analysis and that was then enshrined in the report. The United States suggested that we perceive that war as quick and victorious for the West. They suggested to their allies to mobilize reconnaissance, financial resources, and everything else in order to deal a final blow to Russia. And doing that quickly, and probably they proceeded from the fact that the armament and material in their warehouses were enough in order to somehow affect the political will of the Russian Federation in order to achieve necessary result. A lengthy, protruded military crisis, the need to build up support for Ukraine would require from the countries that support Ukraine to launch their military industry, and in some countries that military or defense industry does not exist yet. In some of the Western countries, services account for about 70 to 80% of the economy. Amid a globalized economy where the West is the focal place offering services, these services are totally futile on the battlefield. And Russia produces as much of material as all the Western countries taken together. That asymmetry that we see there, and that is not reflected by the Russia GDP to the Western GDP ratio, prompts us to discuss how, amid such a military crisis, we can somehow compare the GDPs. And should we use the GDP as an indicator to measure the military capability and capacity? The countries with developed industry, which are capable of autonomous supporting that industry with their own resources and their own farming, would have more sovereignty and more agency than, for instance, some Western countries. The countries like China, Iran, Pakistan, some other countries, Turkey, that have their own military sector that can replenish their resources, certainly find themselves in a more advantageous position. If such conflicts like in Ukraine is a new reality, a new normality. Seeing that, I would like to pass the floor to Dmitry Stefanovich, researcher at the Center for International Security. Dmitry, over to you.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much.
Очень много ценных наблюдений уже было сделано.
A lot of brilliant ideas were shared, and the analysis that was mentioned was also quite remarkable. Very good report, and that's great that the Valdai Discussion Club still focuses on that topic. Let me highlight one interesting thing. Quite recently here we presented another report on a similar topic with an accent on industry and economy and how it changes over time in the light of the special military operation. And in conclusion, we spoke about a cruel new world. And here the report concludes with the words of a wonderful new world. In this conflict and in the wars to come, as the report states, the external support would be pivotal, would be crucial. If actually this support goes on, is quite continuous, then the conflict would be endless. The direct stakeholders may be short-lived, but nevertheless, once the external support continues, they would still be engaged in a conflict. Another problem is that the hostilities in Ukraine showed that, on the one hand, there is a lot of transparency in what is going on there. The data that we get from the spacecrafts, from the drones intercepting cables, the scope of that data is huge. And it's been analyzed using AI, big data analysis, and machine learning, some elements of the AI. But whether we can get a real picture of what is going on there, that's a question, because it's very easy to manipulate the digital data in what is going on in Ukraine. The questions that are being raised by the champions of Ukraine show that we underestimated the Ukrainian potential, just like our Western enemies or adversaries underestimated the Russian potential, and now actually the Ukrainian potential is underrated, underestimated. I think that this actually has something to do with the use of GDP to measure the military capability and capacity. There are lots of methodologies how to do that, but not always. It would stand a reality check, but nevertheless, it doesn't prevent Western retired military and analysts and anonymous bureaucrats, anonymous commanders from sharing their views, ideas, expressing certain tips of trade. And so they tell the Ukrainians that they are not fighting the right way, they have to do something differently. And that means that it's very unlikely that some other countries' armed forces would perform better than the Russian armed forces or the Ukrainian armed forces, because the conflict is unique to a lot of extent. And these articles from the West emerge every now and then. Quite recently, an article was published by General Petraeus, And he said that if
быстрое, высокоточное и так далее.
actually another such conflict emerges or breaks out, then it would be totally different and high precision weapons would be used. But again, it is very much unlikely. Another thing I may mention. A lot of destruction is taking place, even though the nuclear arms are not used. This is what we see in Ukraine. This is what we see during the escalation of a conflict in the Middle East. And in essence,
Просто воевать. Это воевать на своей территории. Воевать, когда сам становишься полем боя.
fighting on your own territory, on your home turf, is the only thing which is worse than just being engaged in a fight. How you can avoid that? There are now universal
И, наверное, еще один очень важный
solutions to that. And another thing, which has been expressed today already,
долгосрочной поддержки вот этого.
this is the long-term support of the hostility, long-term support of the military industry. On the one hand,
заявлений,
a lot of statements were made, especially by Western Europeans. Certain initiatives are being proposed to support armed forces,
скажем так, материализуются.
but they do not come true. So certain plans have been announced, but very often they remain on paper. Why?
Кажется, опять-таки, с мнением, что
I think,
боевые действия
first
прекратятся
of all,
раньше, чем
I believe that the hostilities would be over sooner than later, and the countries hope that they will not have to restructure their approaches because the defense industry of the peaceful times is totally different from the war times military industry.
если финансовые ресурсы на Западе, вероятно, есть
If
для этого.
the West probably has necessary funds for that, but the military capacity is not reduced to money alone. That's about people, that's about raw materials, the feed, and the territories.
Делать пока не очень понятно. Какие заводы новые строятся, в частности, в
Some
Норвегии появились.
Plants are being built, for instance, Norway is building new plants to produce missiles. Something is being done in Germany, in Hamburg. The United States is engaged in that, and some municipal and regional state authorities are doing a lot in order to restart the production of ammo. They're doing that for the sake of bringing up the living standards as well. How do I put that correctly? Was it a good political move or a political campaign when the newly elected governor of New Kansas took a picture against the backdrop of HIMARS, and she said that this is the most popular product produced in that state. So probably this is another consequence of moving to a new age, new epoch. But getting back to the resources and supplies, I think that people would become a problem. Where do we take more people for the military industry and for the armed forces? Certainly migration might be a solution, but probably this is not the most optimal one.
На ситуацию, при которой может быть мобилизовано огромное количество людей как к станку, так и на фронт.
And a situation when a lot of people are called
Западной Европы.
for active military duty or mobilized to work for the military industry is very unlikely. And this is a problem for Russia as well.
С одной стороны, являются
On the one hand, we can show very good figures, for instance, low unemployment rate. But the flip side of that is that we do not have a lot of free hands,
и
free personnel.
мысль совершенно остается под большим вопросом.
And it is quite questionable whether we can move, whether we can return to big armies in the long run. We need some resources for that, and the resources are not taken from nowhere. North Korea, for instance, has a very strong military and defense industry, and it performs very well against the backdrop of a rise of demand for their output, for their product. But whether it can be supported, for instance, matched by or powered by South Korea, because they have a lot of demographic problems there as well. Israel seemingly
мобилизационные возможности.
showed that it can
Но
mobilize people, but again, whether it
ему в долгосрочной перспективе.
can be a lasting phenomena, that's a big question.
На этом я, наверное, закончу.
And I will stop at that, probably. And once again, let me repeat that the report is quite interesting, and I'm sure that we will gather again in order to discuss other things there. Colleagues, should you have any questions, you're most welcome. But now, I have a question to all the panelists.
Обсуждений в ходе подготовки этого доклада
During the preparation of that
вопрос о
report,
индустриальном
we
технологическом суверенитете при подготовке.
discussed the technological and political sovereignty when getting prepared for such armed conflicts for quite a while. A dominating view was that interdependence and distributed supply chains, globalized world would make everyone championing for peace and stability. But when the controversies and contradictions and differences between the countries escalate to the extent that it can be settled down only by hostility, it turned out that such distributed supply chains no longer
И заставляют возвращаться к
guarantee a peace, and a conventional public policy has to be promoted, thus bring about a need to produce the material and armor on their own territory. Certainly, there are no countries in the world that can produce everything on their own territory, but the tendency would go in that direction, I think.
вещи будут производиться на своей территории.
Most critical things have to be produced on your home turf, on your territory. What countries are prepared to localize all the instruments and technologies on their own territory, even if these technologies are not perfect, are not high-tech? As in case of Iran, we know that Iran is developing their own missile and space program, and they have nearly perfect drones. And that means that even being isolated, Iran managed to address a lot of security issues. So let us discuss these questions. And Mr. Kashin, can you please start?
Да, я думаю, это ключевой вопрос.
I think that this is a key question, certainly.
Емкость внутреннего рынка.
The capacity of the domestic market matters. The size of the country matters, because this is the main limitation for the projects. As far as these projects would not be purely military, for the defense purposes, a crucial role would be played by the development of other key sectors of the economy as it used to be before. Anyhow, every major stakeholder will have to have microchip industry of its own. Everyone will have to have machine building capacity, heavy engineering capacity. Probably it won't be advanced, but it has to be. And in that sense, we have an extreme case. For instance, North Korea. For the sake of maintaining their defense self-sufficiency, they managed to create their own engineering and, for instance, they have 3D scanners.
Все это, насколько можно понять, где-то на техническом уровне, наверное, 90-х годов.
And probably, actually, it is dated back to 1990s.
Но когда-то флагмана
CNS equipment.
такой завод был у нас в Иваново.
We had a famous plant in Ivanovo in 1980s. And so the North Korean plants are similar to the plant of 1980. So it means that the country, at the cost of reducing the efficiency and the technological advances, still may become technologically sovereign. such developments have to have some positive consequences as well, because the flip side of the globalization and the flip side of the globalization was the ruining of the middle class in the countries which were involved in such a process. The better paid jobs were eliminated in these developed economies, and they were replaced with poorly paid jobs in the services sector. And that means that a society that goes through such a transformation will not become rich in general, but would become more balanced, in the sense that they will have a more favorable structure, in the sense that more people would be engaged at more high-tech jobs in production. It would have some social and political consequences there as well, because it will require more civil engagement, and big armies will make more people responsible for political decision-making, and therefore the society would get back to the type of relations which was typical for the post-World War II situation, when war veterans would define the social and political processes in most of the countries that were engaged in the World War II. Thank you. Speaking about whether we have to have our own assets, certainly we have to have it. And the USSR had the full cycle of everything and was self-sufficient, self-reliant. Our nuclear triad, despite the fact that in 1990s it was lagging very much behind the United States, but our strategic weapons and nuclear submarines, despite the fact that a lot of phasing out and decommissioning took place there, and the Americans hit us tremendously, and long-range aviation, we managed to retain some of these pieces. We were always losing to the West, but we learned our lessons, in a sense that all our defense companies were focusing on the military production only. What Americans are doing. Certainly, any invention, any new technology was being used in the military. Then some approximation would be done, some simplification would be done, some corners would be cut and then would be brought to the market, and therefore actually it would pay back, helping the military and the civilians make money. It was also done in the USSR as well. All the cigarette and tobacco companies in the Soviet Union during the wartime actually were the ones which would produce the ammunition, so of 7.62 caliber. And once a new technology emerges, and it would be dubbed confidential, and then would be put in the safe, and was never used in the civilian industry. But at the same time, we managed to retain certain advances that we can take advantage of 30 years after the collapse of the USSR. Another thing, I'm not sure about the newly elected governor of Arkansas, but the problem of the United States and most countries of Europe lie in the fact that, unlike the World War II times, all the defense companies are private, meaning that the state doesn't play any role there. And the United States is a very powerful country. they have a very powerful defense industry.
процентов.
I'm not sure about the exact figures, but actually half of the plants are been put on hold.
Нужны инвестиции.
And in order to resume the production, investments are needed, and the investments are private. And in order to bring in
55 миллиметров.
private investments, the rate of return has to be offered. For instance, the shells 155 millimeter, and the private investor would say, I'm ready to give you money, but you have to guarantee that you will buy 10 million rounds from me. And the state cannot give such a guarantee, because it is not sure that it would need so much rounds, so much ammo. Therefore, I would say that the Russian model is more viable,
Тот же Ростех.
because Rostech, the Russian Technological Association, well, implies the private input, but the state plays a bigger role. And this is because of the role of the state that helped us to scale up our production. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Simons,
Если вы хотите что-то добавить,
if you want to add anything, you're most welcome.
Yes. Well, I think one of the problems, because you got two different broad approaches internationally to the issue. One of them is this Western approach led by the US. And it's coming at a time when they have been at this unipolar power, and they're not used to being challenged. And I would also add that if we're looking in terms of intellectual capability and capacity of the political and military leadership, to put it diplomatically, it's not what it used to be. And so if we factor these different things into account, you can see a number of problems with the West. And that is the production of these high-tech, high-cost weapon systems which do not function properly. And the US then forces its so-called allies to take these systems. And I mean, I just need to mention the F-35 aircraft. I mean, it's overrun its development time, it's overrun its budget multitude of times. So the Western system tends to run on this idea of measure of activity. The more money you put into something, the better it is. But this is not the case, and Ukraine is proving this. Whereas you've got this other approach from other countries where you have a measure of effect. That is how good the weapon system is, how robust it is, and if it can be produced in sufficient numbers. I mean, this also bore out in the Second World War. And I think as it stands now, I mean, the West, it cannot really invest too much more because it's going bankrupt. I mean, if you look at the US debt, the interest each month on the US debt is equal to approximately equal to the annual federal budget of the Russian Federation. So, I mean, if we're talking guns and butter, I mean, the West is going to a situation where it can afford neither guns nor butter. And there is increasing social and political discontent with what is seen as fighting a war, which is not in the interests of Europeans and quite counterproductive. So you've got all of these different factors, economic, political, cognitive, etc., and these different approaches, this more ideological as opposed to more practical. So thank you.
спасибо большое.
Thank you so much.
Вижу, у нас есть вопросы аудитории.
I see that we have questions from the floor. 3 questions, so let's take all of them.
Микрофон.
Good afternoon. I have the following question. Bearing in mind the casualties, Ukrainian casualties in Ukraine, if we do not freeze the conflict tomorrow, what would be the development? Will the West somehow agree that Ukraine is defeated, or will pump up more money into that? Again, bear in mind the current casualties in Ukraine. Well, I suggest that we collect all the three questions and then we will take them all. Artyom Sokolov. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting report. My question is more about the human dimension. The report speaks about the big armies of end of the 19th century and early 20th century. At the time, the armies acted as something that is supporting the nation. And an officer, as a figure, would be regarded as an example, as a paragon, as an ideal, performing more social functions rather than military ones. Do you think that such a social construct is possible in modern times, bearing in mind the new cyber realities and many other factors that emerged that make our world different from what used to be then? Thank you so much, Mr. Dubinin. Thank you so much. And before I ask a question, I would like to make a comment. When we're discussing big and very comprehensive problems, it would be good to suggest to the Valdai Discussion Club to disseminate the text of the report so that we could read that beforehand, because I got the text only when I entered the room, and what I managed to read is just the conclusions, a page and a half. So without reading a text, it's very difficult to discuss anything or to say something or to comment on that. So this is my proposition for the future. I think that it would make sense. It would help us to make the discussion more lively. I have a couple of questions, and let me also share some comments, if I may, Mr. Sushentsov. My first question is, just as Mr. Kashin said, we're discussing the situation of a conventional war. But where is this line between a conventional war and weapons of mass destruction war? Where is this line going? And a lot of Western commentators are speaking about that. They say that Mr. Putin said that we're going to resort to any means that we have, to any weapons that we have, etc. Does this line exist, practically or theoretically, between conventional weapons and any other warfare? Because for me, the very fact that Mr. Biden said that we are not going to bring American troops to Ukraine, for me that's exactly, this is the red line, this is the driving line between the use of conventional weapons and weapons of mass destruction. My second question would go to Mr. Buzinski. Conclusions state that in future we have to expect the conscript army rather than a contract professional army. I'm speaking as a layman. I'm totally ignorant about the military questions. Therefore, what I'm speaking about may be totally untrue. Now, Russia is engaged in a war, and in essence, we are using conscripts
осенним призывом прошлого года.
Last autumn, we called people for active military duty, and now President Putin said that we have 300,000 more of volunteers, so to say, who signed the contract, and the society is not engaged in this war.
Вот, скажем, Москва живет, я живу в Москве и вижу, Москва не воюет.
I'm a Muscovite. I'm living in Moscow and see that Moscow is not waging a war. It lives in business as usual life, the one that it used to live in.
Говорится о том, что, так сказать, скорее всего, в перспективе обычно
Most likely,
будут заниматься средние и малые страны.
these would be the small-sized and mid-sized countries that would be engaged in the conventional wars, some by proxy wars, etc.
Потенциала
I
нет.
think that the small and medium-sized countries would lack potential for that, would lack capacity for that. Ukraine is a mid-sized country, and certainly it would not match the Russian troops,
Вот так вот.
but for the United States support. I will not abuse your attention. Thank you so much, and pass the mic to the first row. Thank you. Vyacheslav Shupir from the Institute of Geography. When I was listening to Mr. Kashin's contribution, I could not but remember a very well-known statement by Oskar Peschel, a geographer, who said that a battle was won by a teacher of geography, a statement that is sometimes attributed to Bismarck. What is your take on that paradox? Actually, the defense industry is not reliant on the education and culture and science, then no changes would take place. There is no progress there, so still our science and higher education is not focusing on the military side, but it would be even more interesting to look what is going on the side. Some processes are taking place there, and I would say that these processes are undermining the military capability of these countries. And how do you want to fight a war with such an education and such science? What is your take on that paradox? Well, thank you so much. We collected several questions, and I suggest that each of you takes one question and focuses on that. In reverse order, Dmitry Stefanovich. Well, all these questions, I think, are intertwined, interconnected. This paradox, something I would to start with.
И то, что мы не видим такого всеобщих
Also explains the fact that we don't see any long-term investments and overall industrial mobilization in many countries. This is an attempt to be prepared for,
участвовать в долгосрочных вооруженных конфликтах,
or to be part of the long-term conflicts, armed conflicts, but at the same time,
значительную часть
the countries do not want it to affect the bulk of the society. And Moscow lives a usual life, and I do think that this was one of the objectives of the state. That the conflict, the hostilities, the special military operation, whatever you call it, it should not become a determining factor in the life of every person. Because we have some goals in terms of modernization, in terms of the development, and this is true for every country.
Удастся это или не удастся,
Whether
вопрос огромный, потому что
we would succeed in that or not, that's a big question, because really, we may run out of people for both things, us, I mean any country.
может не хватить человеческого
Any country may run out of people in order to cope to deal with the modernization, development, and preparedness for hostilities. Whether Russia and Ukraine and some European countries may have enough human potential, that's the question. Judging by the casualty rate, I think my estimate says that due to the exhausting of the human potential, this may really happen. There may be some attrition that would trigger some negative political processes, and it would bring an end to a war. But I don't think that we will run out of people for the war. Another statement. The people who would return from the war veterans, would determine the social and political life of the country. So I think, and I can only agree, that it may be like that, and there would be some mutual responsibility shared by the state and by the society, because, for instance, once certain benefits are offered to some political elite, this is one situation, but after the war, probably the benefits will have to be offered to the whole society. Thank you, and Mr. Bushinsky. Certainly, we'll take a question, the first one regarding the casualties. The Ukrainian casualties are huge. Heartbreaking, so to say. Striking. Because when they sent infantry on the minefields, what I said from the very beginning of the crisis, without necessary aviation support, launching an offensive, that's a crazy thing to do. Once you actually are marching on the minefields, that's a crazy thing to do. And speaking about the mobilization potential, if we use the textbook procedure, if we take a total mobilization, the front and the home front, it would engage 10% of the people, of the population. And, for instance, Ukraine entered that war with a population of about 30 million. So it means that 3 million people may be mobilized, may be called for the active military duty and to work for the home front, for the military industry. 10% of the 30 million. But bear in mind that a lot of working age people who could be called for active duty, military duty, left the country. I think that this potential deteriorated. People do not want to fight. If the hostilities go on with intensity, it would last for 6 months more, and then I think that they will just run out of people, run out of soldiers. As for the Poles, or Romanians or Slavs, I'm speaking only about Eastern European countries who can supply their troops. It's very unlikely that Germans would send their troops there. So if the Poles or the Slovaks or the Romanians engage into the fight, certainly we will defeat them. But actually, if the United States interfere with this situation, it would result in a nuclear war. Any confrontation, direct confrontation between the United States and Russia would bring about a total disaster, a nuclear war. Neither Russia nor the United States can be defeated on the battlefield. And that's why they will stop at nothing. They would resort to the exchange of nuclear arms strikes. If the Poles take a decision to send their troops there, and for the Americans that would be the moment of truth probably, but the Americans then would say, this is up to you to fight, and we can supply money, we can supply cannons, but this is up to you to fight. I cannot agree that we have a conscript army of conscripts.
Да, вот это... Нет, вы сказали призывной армии.
You spoke about conscripts.
Ну, тогда извините, потому что
Okay.
мы действительно не воюем призывной армией. Другое
These
дело,
are not
что
conscripts.
впервые, я не знаю, насколько это хватит, но мы, государство, создало очень
We,
привлекательные
the state,
условия для
has created very attractive terms and conditions. Just paying lots of money.
тысяч базовой
200,000 rubles, that's the basic compensation, and there are some benefits, and then a person is paid for every tank being demolished.
ипотеку погасить.
There are lots of people from the countryside who cannot pay their mortgages and who cannot pay off their debts, and suddenly they were
Если говорить
lured by these measures
ну, я не думаю, что
into
нужно
that.
постоянно воевать.
I don't think that we would be engaged in a continuous war.
Силы
I
сократятся,
think that the armed forces would reduce, but certainly we cannot afford a fully professional contract army.
целые подразделения обсчитывали все.
I know whole analytical divisions within the defense ministry which did necessary calculation and came up with the conclusion that we cannot afford that. There is a GDP to other indicators, ratios, etc.
контрактников иметь, ну, где-то
And
не более
we can have no more than
45, до 50%.
50% of the contract professional soldiers, and 50% have to be drafted, have to be conscripts. Otherwise, we would run bankrupt.
В тех Соединенных Штатах. Там военные очень прилично получают.
In the United States, the military are paid very well, so we can afford that. Mr. Simons, if you want to take any question, you're most welcome.
The freezing of the Ukraine war. Well, this is already starting to be proposed by the United States. And as I say, this is a change because initially it underestimated the Russian Federation, its resilience and its commitment to the war. And I mean, this has a similar resonance to how the Ottoman Empire in the First World War was underestimated, although the ending wasn't so good for the Ottoman Empire. But there's arrogance and this hubris that Russia will soon fold, which it has not. So from this Western perspective, there is politically, militarily, there is no big desire to admit that they are wrong in their assessments, ethically, morally, as well as factually. But if we look, the narrative is beginning to change. And I think one of the most telling moments occurred in the Vilnius NATO summit when Zelensky did not understand who he was. He is the object. And when he demanded more, that photo session where everyone turned their back to him, that told what this war is about. So where are we now? The United States in November 2024 has a presidential election. This is going to be one of the decisive factors in pushing the United States to extract itself from this war. If it is going to be increasingly unpopular, the Democrat Party risk losing the election, and especially if their legal warfare against Trump fails and he is a candidate. So they're under a lot of political strain. Hence, there is this beginnings of tentative moves to push the idea to freeze the war. Is this in Russia's interests? No, absolutely not. Because it's understood that Ukraine had been built up as a weapon against Russia since the Euromaidan revolution. And the confessions of Merkel and others that the Minsk agreement was used as a cover to give Ukraine time to weaponize itself against Russia. So, I mean, the duplicity and the absolute lack of transparency of the West means that they cannot be trusted. And so this war, of course, would not favor Russia if it is frozen in its current state. And these are the underlying reasons for that.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Cushion?
Да, начну с вопроса.
Let me start with a question about the culture and the role of officers in the society.
Очевидно, что в новой эпохе нас ждет
It
формирование
becomes obvious that in the new age, in the new epoch, a new military culture would be shaped.
новое отношение к людям военной
There will be a new
специальности.
attitude towards the military.
Есть стихийный процесс в этом направлении.
There are some spontaneous processes taking place there that escalate, that are on the rise, and these processes cannot be run.
Первыми начали системно подходить к этому вопросу. И
First people who took a systemic approach to that issue, building a subculture related to a war, that was Wagner Group, private military company, which obviously
на эти цели системно хороших специалистов,
engaged very good professionals for that, and they
проработанную систему символов,
created necessary symbols, tokens,
историю,
mascots, creating legends, and the whole world was created around Wagner Group.
преимущество менее крупные частные
And therefore,
организации перед государственной,
less
она может действовать в
big,
этом отношении быстро.
Small size private organization
Очевидно, некий
finds
подобный
itself in a more favorable position, unlike the state, where the state-owned structure. But I think that what we may expect is that we will have to
идеологию,
bring about an ideology, certain symbols, tokens,
истории,
telling stories,
корпоративные мифы.
making legends and myths
И это то, что нас ждет.
regarding the military. This is what awaits us. Speaking about education, as far as I can see, I have school-age children, and again, I see some consistent efforts in order to bring about patriotism at schools.
Всегда носят довольно,
As a rule,
довольно
as usual,
непродуманный и зачастую бестолковый
they
характер, но
actually lack order.
нормальная ситуация в начале каждого
They
процесса, которым
actually
занимается большая государственная
are not to the point, but this is typical for any big process. This has been done not a very efficient and optimal way,
достаточно быстро, но вектор задан. То есть
but the vector has been set.
какое-то время эти изменения наберут силу,
Sometime from now, these changes would
и мы увидим их последствия.
gain its force and we'll see the consequences, and sometimes probably the consequences would be far-reaching. Some processes are taking place in the mass culture. This is inevitable for the country which is engaged in a war. Certain tendencies would be denied by the society and some tendencies would be accepted. So the war transforms everything. Really, because Ukraine
Величина с Россией, Россия
is not a match for Russia, and Russia may wage a war engaging a little part of its resources.
даже в Москве, да, в Москве 20 тысяч человек
Moscow,
направлено в войска
20,000
частичной мобилизации.
conscripts were summoned, were called for active military duty, and more than 40,000 Muscovites are engaged in the war.
Это означает,
And
что
40,000 out of the 12 million people living in Moscow is almost nothing, so it means that most of the people are not engaged in that directly, but nevertheless, even these 40,000, all in all, taking into account their family members, that would make about 100,000 people
чувствуют свое
who
соприкосновение.
feel being affiliated with the war, associated with the war. But in other cities and regions of Russia, where the burden of the war per capita is bigger, it is not dramatically bigger
Но повыше
than in Moscow, but as far as
концентрация вузов, органов
in
управления.
Moscow we have lots of academia, universities and public administration agencies. Therefore, this load is not so huge, but in the countryside,
Там
or in the cities next to the military bases, There are military cemeteries, and that situation is perceived totally differently.
Тоже преуменьшать это не следует.
We should not underestimate that. We should not overlook that. But certainly for Russia, a conflict in Ukraine is a small part of a more global conflict against the West. Russia tries to maintain its sustainability, defeating Ukraine but ruining our economy. It means to lose.
Это должно быть совершенно ясно.
And
Как быстро
that goes without saying.
иссякнут ресурсы,
How fast Ukraine may run out of resources.
изучение военной истории, там,
The military history, for instance, the history of the World War II shows that
размеры украинских потерь мы
the
узнаем только когда будем
amount of casualties in Ukraine we will learn only once we get hold of documents and the archives.
возможно только если у вас есть внутренние
So it means
документы.
that only once you have the confidential data from the other side, you can be
Войной
quite sure about the amount of casualties. Prior to the war, Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief, said that their
Совбеза
human resource, soldier resource, is about 2 million people, and
2,5 миллиона человек.
Danilov, who is the secretary of the Security Council of Ukraine, said that they can mobilize up to 2.5 million people. Now,
По отрывочным высказываниям
according to some data that we get from the Ukrainian bureaucrats,
1,3 миллиона человек.
1.3 million people have already been
Около 300 тысяч, более
called
300
for active military duty, and 300,000
служб.
troops were
Мы видим, что
in the armed forces, the guards, etc. prior to the war. And we see that Ukraine now is changing the categories. They changed the definition of the mobilization resource or reservists.
например, с легкими
And for instance, mentally ill people can be
инвалидов,
called for active duty. People with disabilities no longer
по всем
can be
раненые,
free from conscription.
составляют существенную
And
величину.
now we see that the number of people wounded, killed in action, missed in action,
вооруженных силах
and its ratio to
к тем, кого
how many
еще
people
можно было бы-
they still have and who they can
Они огромны.
summon for military duty
Я бы
is
воздержался. Они
dramatic.
достаточно велики, чтобы создавать напряжение.
So it means that they still have necessary resources.
Опыт говорит о том,
But
что
again,
при
my
наличии
experience shows that
должных политических условий, даже
once certain political will persists, even in such a situation, a war can be continued, but at a very dire price for the society. But for instance, Paraguay,
парагвайской войны
in the course of the Great Paraguayan War of
50-х годов
1874,
до полного своего поражения, и
fought
когда
until its final defeat, and then what was defeated, it turned out that
мужского населения
9/10 of its male population were killed. So the female population surpassed the male population 10 times. And now we see that
уже мобилизация студентов, получающих там первое образование, высшее дневное.
now the students,
Там как идет по этапам,
full-time students now have been called for active duty,
180 тысяч человек. Раньше их не
and
учили.
180,000 people may be called for active military duty now.
Студентов, которые в
The
академическом
students
отпуске, вот,
who took
ну,
a
видимо,
leave also will be called for military duty.
студентов было в 21
And in 2021, I think that Ukraine had about 1.5 million students, and 60% of them are female.
могут они или не могут.
It would be detrimental to their middle class, but can they afford that politically? And they can last for some time. It won't change the final outcome,
Требует тоже и
but
времени,
it
и
require from us time and resources and costs.
многие месяцы.
And it would mean many months of a war. Thank you so much, colleagues. And to conclude our report, we can come up with a conclusion that the factors that
большой войны сейчас
would prevent any big wars are no longer valid. And now, these states consider hostilities and armed conflicts as a way to achieve their political goals, and the countries that can boast some strategic autonomy to reproduce their military resource on their own territory. Bear in mind their own resource, have necessary political will to
свой народ к достижению цели всеми возможными инструментами.
to achieve these goals at any cost, at any price. These countries will feel more confident in this new reality. Although certainly there is a lot of anxiety in international relations, but let us remember the positive phenomena, perceiving each other as the adversaries. The nuclear deterrence was good during the Cold War in the sense that we realized that peace is fragile, it is not given for granted, and its maintenance deserves efforts.
Кругом ответственных держав, если они их прикладывают, они все же приводят к тому,
A
что
number of responsible countries may bring about stability.
по нашему впечатлению
Now,
многие элиты
we
зарубежные
believe that many elites of the Western countries
в эмоциональном раже находятся, когда
are overreactive
ответственные заявления,
when they make blazing
чем хуже, тем лучше.
statements that the worse the better,
Возможно, стратегическая победа.
and probably they can nurture an idea that Russia may be strategically defeated. Certainly this is an illusion, and there will be a sobering moment, but it's very important that once this sobering moment comes, they have to be reasonable enough
вот этот дух
to
трезвости и ощущение, что мир хрупок. И его
act
поддержание
pragmatically so that they would realize that the peace is fragile. But I would agree with Dmitry Stefanovich, who says that we'll have a lot of job to do. I think that before we reach that point, a lot of time would lapse. Thank you so much. I'm sure that we will meet again in that room discussing major military crisis of our times. Thank you so much.